I was 9 years old the day my father vanished into the woods. It was a Saturday in late October when the trees along Black Hollow Ridge looked like they were bleeding fire. My mom had just taken an apple pie from the oven when the phone rang. She answered, listened for a few seconds, and then dropped the receiver as if it had burned her. The pie slid off the counter and shattered across the floor, cinnamon and sugar steaming against the tile. That's the kind of detail your brain shouldn't remember, but mine does. I remember her eyes. I remember the sound of my grandfather's truck pulling up outside, gravel crunching like bones under tires. And I remember the words that would shape every day of my life that followed. "Tom's missing," Grandpa said. "He never came back from the ridge." People disappear in the Appalachians more often than most realize. The land swallows them up. Hunters, hikers, even whole families. The official reports call it getting turned around, which is mountain talk for the forest didn't want to give them back. My father, Thomas Ward, wasn't the type to get turned around. He grew up in those hills, same as my Uncle Robert, Rob for short. They knew every trail, every creek bend, every marker carved by generations of coal miners. But that weekend, the woods decided otherwise. According to Uncle Rob, they were about half a mile east of the ridge when Dad realized he'd left his grunter in the truck. It's a small call whistle hunters use to mimic a buck's grunt, supposed to draw deer closer. Dad joked it was his lucky charm, never shot anything without it. So he told Rob to wait by the old fire break while he jogged back to fetch it. He never came back. Rob said he waited 30 minutes before he started to worry. He followed the same trail back toward the truck, calling Dad's name. He found the truck unlocked, keys still dangling in the ignition. No footprints led away from the area, just a faint drag mark near the edge of the tree line that searchers later said was probably a tire rut. By nightfall, the McDowell County Sheriff's Department had every available deputy combing those woods. The search lasted 2 weeks. They found nothing, no body, no gun, no torn clothing. It was as if the mountain had exhaled, and my father was part of the breath that never came back. That was 15 years ago. When you're 9, you don't understand the permanence of loss. You just expect people to walk back through the door someday. Mom kept his name on the missing persons register until I was in high school. Grandpa sold his old truck to pay for a private investigator, a retired cop from Charleston. The man spent months up there charting mine shafts, talking to locals, even bringing in cadaver dogs. But in the end, all he found was a piece of graffiti deep in one of the old tunnels, a spray-painted circle with jagged symbols carved through it, half covered by soot. He said it was probably kids. That explanation never sat right with me. Over the years, Uncle Rob stayed close to us. He visited every holiday, always quiet, always carrying something heavy inside him. When I was little, I thought it was sadness. Later, I realized it was guilt. He blamed himself for letting Dad go back alone. But grief has a strange way of mutating over time. It becomes a shape that fits into your life, like a scar you forget to hide. By the time I was 25, I'd learned to live with it. I worked at a mechanic shop in Bluefield, kept my head down, drank on Fridays, and told myself I was fine. Then one spring afternoon, Mom called. "Ethan," she said, "your Uncle Rob wants to see you." I hadn't heard from him in 5 years. He lived near the edge of Filbert, a small mining town that looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of West Virginia. When I pulled up to his house, I half expected to find an empty porch and silence. Instead, he opened the door before I could knock, grinning in that shy way he used to. "You look just like him," were his first words. We spent the afternoon catching up. He'd gotten sober, picked up woodworking, and looked healthier than I remembered. The air smelled of cedar and beer, a combination that oddly comforted me, but as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the conversation turned. "You ever think about going back there?" he asked. "Back where?" I said, though I already knew. "The ridge, Black Hollow. I go there sometimes. Helps me think." I didn't answer right away. The idea of revisiting that place felt like reopening a wound I'd worked years to close. But he kept talking, voice low, eyes somewhere far away. "I know it won't change anything," he said, "but you should see it once. It's not as haunted as you remember." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. It took nearly a year before I agreed. We set the date for the first Saturday in May. Rob insisted we start early before the heat and the bugs woke up. The morning fog hung thick over the valley, making everything look softer, like an old photograph. I drove my pickup along a dirt road that wound through the hills until it ended in a clearing. That's where Dad's truck had been found all those years ago. Rob was already there, standing beside his Jeep with a thermos in hand. "You ready for a walk down memory lane?" he said. "Not sure that's the word I'd use," I replied. We followed the same trail that my father had taken 15 years earlier. The forest had reclaimed most of it. Moss covered the stones, vines crept across fallen logs, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves. Birds called somewhere above, but otherwise the woods were still. Too still. After an hour, we reached Big Creek, a silver ribbon cutting through the green. We sat on a flat rock, sharing cold cuts and a couple of beers. For a while, it felt almost normal, like two men honoring a ghost with quiet remembrance. Then Rob spoke. "There's something I never told your mom," he said. "Or you." He took a long sip before continuing. "The last time I saw your dad wasn't when he walked back toward the truck." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I saw him again. Or I thought I did." He pointed toward the opposite ridge, where a line of dark trees concealed the entrance to an old mining pit. I was calling his name, running through the woods. Then I looked up and saw him, same jacket, same hat, walking into that mine. A cold ripple went through me. "You told the police that?" "I told them everything," he said quietly. "But by the time I got there, the tunnel was empty. No footprints, nothing." He paused, rubbing his hands together. "You ever feel like something's watching you? Not a person, not an animal, something older than that?" I didn't answer. The silence stretched between us until the sound of running water filled it. Rob stood. "Come on, there's something you need to see." We hiked another mile along the ridge, the path growing narrower and rockier. The woods darkened as we approached a jagged outcropping that overlooked the valley. Below, the earth yawned open, a black scar running into the hillside, the old mine. Rusting signs warned of unstable ground and toxic gases, but the entrance was still there, framed by rotting timbers and wild briar. "That's where I saw him," Rob said. "Right there." I felt my throat tighten. The idea that my father had walked willingly into that darkness made no sense. He was cautious to a fault. "You sure it was him?" I asked. Rob's jaw worked. "I'm sure of what I saw, but what I heard after, I don't know." He stepped closer to the opening. The air around it felt wrong, heavier, thicker. I could taste rust on my tongue. "I come here every year," he said. "It's the only place I can think straight. Sometimes I swear I hear him calling from down there." The words sent a chill through me. I wanted to turn back, to tell him this was a mistake, but something in his voice, something broken, made me stay. He looked at me. "You want to go down?" I hesitated, then nodded. We circled the pit until we found a safer descent. The slope was steep but manageable, littered with chunks of shale and the remnants of rusted equipment. By the time we reached the bottom, the daylight had faded to a dim copper hue. The mine's mouth loomed before us. Inside, it was absolute black. Rob pulled out a flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, revealing splintered beams and tracks for mine carts long since buried in dust. "You sure this is a good idea?" I asked. He shrugged. "Closure, remember?" The deeper we went, the colder it became. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, bouncing back distorted and strange. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, soft, like air escaping through teeth. But when I looked at Rob, he didn't seem to notice. About 50 yards in, the tunnel split into two. Rob motioned for me to follow him left. The smell changed, musty at first, then metallic like iron and damp stone. The air seemed to vibrate. That's when we found the graffiti. It was smeared across the wall in a pattern that made no sense. Spirals intersecting jagged symbols. The same ones the investigator had described years ago. Someone or something had drawn them in a dark, oily substance that glistened under the beam. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Rob didn't answer. He was staring deeper into the tunnel, his flashlight trembling slightly. "Do you hear that?" he said. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then a faint sound, a rhythmic tap, like something metallic striking stone, echoing from somewhere ahead. "Could be water dripping," I said. He shook his head. "That's not water." Before I could respond, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before, pressing against my eardrums. Rob turned to me, his face pale. "We should go." We started back toward the entrance. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself it was just nerves. But halfway to the mouth, I realized Rob wasn't beside me anymore. I spun around. His flashlight beam was gone. "Rob?" I called. The sound of my voice bounced back, warped by the tunnel. Then faintly, I heard him, farther down, calling my father's name. "Tom, that you?" My stomach dropped. "Rob, stop it! Come back!" No answer, just that faint metallic tap again, quicker now, like a signal. I ran toward the noise, flashlight shaking in my hand. The tunnel opened into a wide chamber, walls streaked with black residue. Rob stood in the middle, facing the darkness ahead. He was holding his pistol. "Rob," I said carefully, "put the gun down." He didn't move. "There's something down here," he murmured. "He's down here. I can hear him." Then, without warning, he turned and fired into the dark. The blast was deafening. Dust exploded from the walls, raining over us. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "What the hell are you doing?" He spun toward me, eyes wide, unseeing. "You don't understand. He's calling me. He's calling both of us." He yanked free and stumbled deeper into the mine. The tapping grew louder, closer. I tried to follow, but the air shifted again. A rush of warmth and a smell so foul it made me gag. It wasn't rot. It was like burning metal, sulfur and death mixed together. "Rob!" I shouted. Something moved in the dark, a shadow shifting between the beams of our flashlights. It crawled along the wall like smoke, forming and reforming until it almost looked human. That's when Rob screamed. The sound echoed through the mine, raw and animal. I ran, heart pounding, stumbling over rocks until I saw daylight ahead. I burst out into the open air, gasping, collapsing onto the ground. Behind me, the tunnel was silent. When I finally dared to look back, there was no sign of Rob. Hours later, the sheriff's deputies arrived after I called from the nearest gas station. They searched the mine for 2 days. They found Rob's flashlight, his pistol, and 4 spent shell casings. No body. The report blamed it on toxic gas exposure, claiming we'd suffered hallucinations. They said Rob had probably wandered deeper into the tunnels and fallen through a shaft. But I know what I saw. Something in that mine wanted us there, wanted him. Maybe it wanted my father, too. I told myself I'd never go back, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of that sound again, the tapping. And in the dream, it's not random. It's a pattern, 3 short, 1 long, over and over, like someone or something trying to get out. If you're still here, thank you for listening. Stories like this one take time and courage to tell. If you'd like to hear what really hides in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of stories too strange to be fiction, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It keeps this channel alive, and it gives me the strength to keep digging into the dark places most people avoid. Because somewhere out there, under all that dirt and silence, my story isn't finished yet. They say the mind plays tricks on you when you're afraid, that what you think you hear, what you think you see, is just panic echoing in an empty room. But what if the room isn't empty? What if the darkness is alive, and the trick is that it lets you think it isn't? For weeks after Uncle Rob disappeared, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mine entrance again. The smell, the heat, the scream that didn't sound human. The deputies were kind enough at first. They asked questions, took statements, wrote everything down with the same look of tired disbelief they probably used on every missing person case. I told them about the tapping, the graffiti, the way the air changed inside that tunnel. One deputy, an older guy named Harlan, listened without interrupting. When I finished, he scratched his chin and said quietly, "You know, this ain't the first time somebody's gone missing up there." That got my attention. He wouldn't elaborate much. Just said the old mine had a reputation. People who wandered in sometimes didn't wander back out. A few search parties over the decades had ended the same way. No trace, no closure. But what chilled me most was when he added, "Some of them said they heard knocking." Same as you. The report eventually labeled Rob's case as presumed dead due to environmental exposure. But the thing about official reports is that they only care about what can be measured, not what can be felt. Mom cried for weeks. She'd already lost a husband to those woods, now a brother too. I told her I'd never go back there, and for a while I meant it. But nightmares have a way of rewriting your promises. It started about a month later. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing that same tapping in my walls. 3 short, 1 long, always in the same rhythm. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping the siding or maybe a loose pipe, but then I heard it when I wasn't home, coming from my truck's dashboard as I drove. It wasn't until I dreamed of the mine again that I realized something had followed me back. In the dream, I'm standing at the tunnel entrance, light spilling in from behind me. My father's silhouette stands at the far end, just out of reach. He's holding the grunter whistle to his lips. The sound that comes out isn't a deer call, it's a voice, broken, hollow, whispering my name. Ethan. I wake up before I can answer. By the time summer rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I told myself I'd go back one last time, not into the mine, but close enough to see it in daylight. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a place, nothing more. I left before dawn, driving the same route I had with Rob months earlier. The woods were green and humming with insects. sunlight catching the mist in beams that looked almost holy. It felt peaceful, almost enough to make me laugh at how scared I'd been. But peace doesn't last long in those hills. The closer I got to the ridge, the quieter everything became. The cicadas stopped. The birds went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When I stepped out of the truck, I noticed something strange. Fresh tire tracks in the mud. There hadn't been any the first time we came. Someone or something had been up here recently. I followed them out of habit, my boots sinking into the wet earth. They led straight toward the mine. The entrance looked smaller in daylight, less threatening, but the warning signs that had once stood near it were gone. Posts splintered as if something had torn them down. For a long time, I just stood there. Part of me wanted to shout, to curse the place for what it took. Another part wanted to kneel and whisper an apology to the ground, as if the mountain itself might forgive me. Then I heard it. Tap, 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 pause, tap. It came from inside the mine. I froze. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I told myself it was water again, just water. But the sound repeated louder, closer, tap, 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 pause, tap, and then faintly, a voice. Ethan. I backed away, eyes locked on the darkness. Every instinct screamed to run, but the voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded sad, broken. Ethan, help me. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for the light to change, for shadows to crawl across the mouth of the mine like fingers. Then, as if some invisible cord snapped, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. When I looked back, the entrance was empty. The forest was quiet again. That night, I packed a small bag and drove to stay with my mother for a few days. I told her everything, the tapping, the dreams, the voice. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she said, "You sound just like your uncle did." "What do you mean?" "The last few months before he disappeared, Rob told me he could hear your father, said Tom was trying to tell him something." I stared at her, unable to breathe. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was grief talking," she said softly. "Now I'm not so sure." She reached into a drawer and handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the grunter, the same one Dad had gone back to retrieve the day he vanished. "They found it in the bed of his truck," she said. "I couldn't bear to throw it away." The whistle was old, smooth from use. When I lifted it to my lips, it made no sound, clogged maybe with dust or time. But when I held it, I felt something, like the faint hum of a tuning fork under my skin. I put it down quickly. That night, the tapping didn't come from the walls. It came from the box. Over the next week, things escalated. Tools went missing in the garage, only to reappear in strange places, lined up perfectly along the windowsill, or laid in the shape of a cross on the porch. I'd wake to find dirt tracked through the house, though the doors were locked. On the 6th night, I woke to the sound of whispering. 2 voices, low and overlapping, coming from the living room. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept down the hallway. The whispering stopped as soon as I entered the room. The air smelled of wet stone. The box lay open on the coffee table. Inside, the grunter was gone. Something shifted in the reflection of the window. 2 shapes standing just outside, motionless. I blinked, and they were gone. The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office. I told them I needed access to the mine again, that I had reason to believe my uncle might still be alive. The new sheriff, a woman named Daniels, looked at me like I'd just stepped out of a fever dream. "Mr. Ward," she said, That site's been sealed off for safety reasons. Gas, structural collapse, you name it. You go back in there, you're risking your life." I told her I understood. Then I waited until nightfall and went anyway. By the time I reached Black Hollow Ridge again, rain had begun to fall, thin and cold. I parked a mile from the site and hiked the rest, flashlight tucked under my jacket. When I reached the mine, the entrance was partially collapsed, but a narrow gap still gaped near the side. I crouched and slipped inside. The air was colder than I remembered. My breath fogged in front of me. The beam of my flashlight caught the same twisted graffiti from before, but there were new marks, too, fresh ones carved deep into the rock. They formed words this time. Letters. "Stay." I swallowed hard. "Rob?" I called. Something answered, not in words, just that same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap. I followed it deeper, every few feet. The air seemed to pulse with heat, like invisible waves rolling through the tunnel. The smell returned, burning metal and something older, sour, unnatural. Then I saw it. Lying on the ground near one of the side chambers was the grunter whistle. It gleamed wet in the beam of my flashlight. I bent down to pick it up, and the instant my fingers touched it, the tapping stopped. In its place came a sound I'll never forget. Breathing, not mine, not human. Slow, wet inhales, as if something enormous were drawing air through waterlogged lungs. The sound filled the tunnel, echoing from every direction. I turned the flashlight toward the noise and froze. The graffiti on the walls wasn't paint. It was moving. The black streaks shimmered, twisting like veins under skin, pulsing in rhythm with the breathing. Then came a whisper, close enough to feel against my ear. "Welcome back." I dropped the flashlight and ran. The beam spun wildly, catching glimpses of the tunnel, the same symbols, a flash of movement, something long and thin sliding along the wall. My shoulders slammed into rock, but I kept running until the cold night air hit my face. I didn't stop. Not when I reached the truck, not when I hit the highway, not until I saw the lights of town. When I finally looked at my hand, I was still holding the whistle. Only now it wasn't cold, it was warm. I left West Virginia the next morning, packed up what little I owned and drove south, telling myself I'd start over somewhere flat and quiet, somewhere without mountains, but starting over doesn't mean escaping. A month later, I got a call from Sheriff Daniels. "We've sealed off the entire ridge," she said. "Explosives. No one's going back in there again." I thanked her, though I didn't know why. "Mr. Ward," she added, hesitating, "one of my deputies found something near the site before we closed it off. Thought you might want to know." "What was it?" She took a deep breath. "An old hunting whistle. Looked hand-carved. Had initials burned into the side, R.W. She paused. "But here's the strange part. It was buried in the same place we found your father's truck key all those years ago, and that area's been cleared a dozen times. So how it ended up there?" Her voice trailed off. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. After the call, I drove until I found an overlook high enough to see the mountains in the distance. The setting sun turned them blood red, the way they had looked the day Dad disappeared. I took the grunter from my pocket and held it up. For the first time, I noticed something new carved into its side, marks that hadn't been there before. Tap, 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 pause, tap, the same rhythm. I set it down on the ground beside me. Sometimes I think about what Uncle Rob said, that the mountain watches, that it remembers. Maybe he was right. Maybe it doesn't take people. Maybe it keeps them. Whatever the truth is, I know this much. The ridge isn't done with me, and every time I hear that rhythm on my walls in my dreams, or in the hum of the wind through the trees, I remember his voice in the dark. Welcome back. If you've stayed through this story, thank you. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sharing them helps me breathe again. If you want to hear the next two stories, true accounts from deep in the Appalachian dark, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and turn on the notification bell. It's free, it helps more than you think, and it keeps me out there searching for the truth behind the legends. Because somewhere out there, past the ridges and the rust, there are still stories waiting to be told, and some of them are still alive. I used to think there was no such thing as a cursed place. That was before Hollow Creek. In anthropology, we're taught that every story, no matter how bizarre, has an origin. My work focuses on Appalachian kinship networks and oral traditions, and I've heard my share of strange accounts. Tales of lights moving through fog, of whispers in the woods, of hollers where time doesn't flow the same. They're folklore, artifacts of fear shaped by isolation and hardship. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. When the university approved my proposal to study an isolated community near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, I thought I'd found the perfect research site. Hollow Creek, a village that barely appeared on maps. I'd read a handful of vague mentions in old county records, birth registries with missing surnames, census entries scratched out in ink, a genealogical ghost. People told me the road out there was rough, that the folks up the ridge didn't take kindly to outsiders. But that kind of remoteness was exactly what I needed. Somewhere untouched by modern anthropology, somewhere pure. The drive alone felt like a descent into another century. The further I went, the more the asphalt crumbled until it gave way to gravel, then dirt. The woods thickened around me, swallowing the daylight. Cell service vanished miles before the GPS stopped working. By the time I saw the hand-painted sign reading Hollow Creek 5 miles, I'd started to wonder if the rumors about people disappearing in these mountains had more truth to them than I'd ever believed. But I pushed on. That's what academics do. When I finally reached the village, it was smaller than I expected. A handful of clapboard houses leaned against the hillside, roofs bowed under decades of rain. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. Chickens scratched in the dirt. The air smelled of pine, wet soil, and something faintly metallic. A man in overalls watched me from the porch of what passed for a general store. His face was lined like tree bark. When I introduced myself and explained that I was a researcher studying local genealogy, his eyes narrowed. "Don't reckon we've got much use for studying," he said. I smiled politely. "I'm just here to listen, to learn about the history of Hollow Creek, the families, the traditions." He cut me off with a slow shake of his head. "Folks up there don't talk about history, they live it." I asked what he meant, but he only pointed toward a narrow path winding up the ridge. "You go talk to the old woman," he said. "If she wants to speak, she will." "Who is she?" He spat into the dirt. "Name's Oneta. Been here longer than anyone should." The path was steep, cutting through dense forest where sunlight barely reached the ground. My boots sank into mud, and gnats buzzed in the humid air. After what felt like an hour, the trees opened into a small clearing where 3 houses sat in a cluster. An elderly woman sat on the porch of the middle house, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Her hands were paper-thin, but steady. She looked up as I approached. "Afternoon," I said, smiling. "I'm Dr. Sanders from UNC Chapel Hill. I was told you might be willing to talk to me about Hollow Creek." She didn't answer, just studied me with dark, steady eyes. Finally, she said, "Mama's inside. She the one you want." I hesitated. "Your mother?" The woman nodded. "She old, don't talk much, but she remembers." She gestured toward the door. I thanked her and stepped onto the porch. Before I could knock, it creaked open. 2 men stood there, tall, thin, their faces weathered from sun and time. Brothers, I thought immediately. "She's resting," one of them said. "I won't be long," I replied softly. They looked at each other, then stepped aside. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant exactly, but heavy. Wood smoke, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lamp. In the far corner, beneath a patchwork quilt, lay what at first I thought was a bundle of bones. Then it moved. The old woman, Oneta's mother, turned her head toward me. Her eyes were sunken deep. Her skin drawn so tight across her cheekbones that it looked translucent. I'd seen elderly subjects before, centenarians who'd lived through wars and famines. But this woman was different. There was a stillness about her, an absence of decay. I sat on a stool, the sons dragged over, and introduced myself again, speaking slowly. "Can you tell me your name, ma'am?" She didn't respond. One of the sons murmured, "Her name's Oneta, too. She, the first one." I nodded, scribbling a note in my pad. "And how long has your family lived here?" The old woman's eyes flicked toward me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer. "Ma'am, did you say—" "She weak," one of the sons interrupted. "Don't push her." "I understand," I said, but I didn't back away. There was something in her gaze, an intensity that felt almost magnetic. I tried a different approach. "You've seen a lot of years," I said gently. "What's your secret?" "Clean living, mountain air." This time she moved her mouth again, and a sound came, a rasping whisper, barely more than breath. "It eats the years." The words were so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard them right. "Excuse me?" I asked. Her eyes widened. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked gasps. "It eats the years," she croaked again, louder, before her body jerked violently. The bowl of peas tumbled to the floor as her sons rushed to her side. "Go!" one of them shouted at me. "Now!" I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stool, and fled through the door. The last thing I saw before it slammed behind me was the old woman's mouth open in a silent scream. By the time I made it back down the ridge, dusk was falling. The man from the store was gone, and the village felt abandoned. I got in my car and drove until the signal bars returned to my phone. I tried to convince myself it was just age, maybe dementia, maybe exhaustion, but the words echoed in my mind all the way back to my apartment in Chapel Hill. It eats the years. For days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I listened to the recording I'd made of the interview over and over. Her voice, if you could call it that, seemed to fade in and out, distorted by static. Every time she said the phrase, there was a strange low hum beneath it, almost like a growl too low for human ears. When I mentioned it to a colleague, a folklorist named Daniel who specialized in Appalachian oral myths, he frowned. "I've heard that expression before," he said, "but not as a metaphor. As a warning." "From where?" He rubbed his chin. "Old miners used to talk about something they called the hollow thing. Said it wasn't a ghost, but a hunger. It didn't take bodies, it took time. Took your years. Folks who came back from those parts looked older than they should." I laughed nervously. "So, what, like an Appalachian vampire?" He didn't laugh. "You joke now, Mira, but don't go chasing it. some stories bite back. A week later, I did exactly what he told me not to do. I returned to Hollow Creek, only this time the village was gone. I mean that literally. The houses were still there, but empty. Windows shattered, doors hanging open. No smoke from the chimneys, no animals, no people. The silence was suffocating. I walked from house to house, calling out names, no answer, no footprints in the dirt, no sign of struggle. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. At the top of the ridge, I reached the old woman's house. The door creaked open when I pushed it. Inside, the bed was stripped, the lamp gone. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but on the wall above where the bed had been, words were carved deep into the wood. "It feeds." My stomach dropped. I snapped a few photos, then turned to leave. That's when I noticed something lying on the floor, a strand of white hair, impossibly long, curled like thread. When I picked it up, it disintegrated between my fingers. I left the house and didn't look back. Back at the university, I threw myself into research. I spent hours in the archives, searching through every old map, record, and newspaper that mentioned Hollow Creek. There wasn't much, but what I found made my blood run cold. In an 1872 mining ledger, there was a reference to a place called Hunger Hollow, a settlement near the same coordinates. The entry described anomalous longevity among residents, with miners claiming that time itself seems slower there. A few years later, a fire destroyed the mine, and every record of the village ended. No death certificates, no relocations, just gone. It couldn't be coincidence. In another account, a fur trapper from the 1700s wrote of a valley where age walks backward. He claimed he'd seen a child turn gray-haired overnight, while an old man nearby stood taller and younger than before. The trapper's name was unreadable. The ink faded, but the coordinates matched Hollow Creek almost exactly. I spent nights cross-referencing folklore databases, trying to connect patterns, tales of eternal youth, time sickness, and vanishing communities. Every culture has some version of it, but here in Appalachia, the legends felt closer, less symbolic, more lived. By the third week, I started noticing something strange in the mirror. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue lines that hadn't been there before. My reflection looked tired, drawn. My eyes had a dullness I couldn't shake. I told myself it was stress, but when I pulled up the photos from Hollow Creek to catalog them, I realized my hands in the images looked older, skin thinner, veins sharper. That's when I stopped sleeping. The first time I noticed the changes, I tried to rationalize them. Lack of sleep, poor diet, stress. Those were easy explanations, comforting ones. But the second time, when I compared my reflection to my university ID photo taken just 8 months prior, there was no comfort to be found. My face had aged 10 years. It wasn't just the fine lines, it was the hollowness around my eyes, the way my jaw looked sharper, the faint tremor in my hands. My hair, once a warm chestnut, had developed thin strands of gray, subtle but undeniable. I remember staring into that mirror, my mind searching for anything rational. Radiation exposure, environmental toxins, some rare stress-induced illness. But deep down, I knew the truth had roots in the mountains. I hadn't just studied Hollow Creek, I had brought something back from it. The nightmares returned first, always the same. I was back in the clearing at the top of the ridge, standing before the old woman's bed. Except she wasn't frail anymore. She was sitting upright, her skin smooth and ageless, her eyes sharp as glass. When she spoke, her voice was both hers and not, layered, echoing as though a dozen others were speaking through her. "You took from it," she would whisper. "Now it takes from you." And then her mouth would open too wide, stretching, swallowing light until the dream collapsed into black. I started keeping a recorder by my bed, convinced I was muttering in my sleep, maybe speaking phrases in another language. One night, I played the tape back and heard something that made me physically ill. It wasn't my voice, it was a chorus, dozens of overlapping whispers, all chanting the same words in a language I didn't recognize. Then, beneath it, faint but clear, a single English sentence. "It feeds through the remembering." I dropped the recorder and vomited into the sink. The idea gnawed at me for days. Through the remembering. Did that mean by telling the story? I was feeding it, by studying it. I thought about Daniel, the folklorist who'd warned me. I called him one evening, desperate for clarity. When he picked up, his tone was strained, cautious. "Mira, where are you calling from?" "Chapel Hill," I said. I think I brought something back." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "How long since you went up the ridge?" "About a month." "You've seen changes? Physical?" "Yes, I don't know what's happening to me. "Stop talking about it," he interrupted. "Whatever you do, stop saying its name. Don't write about it. Don't even think about it." "What are you talking about?" "You're feeding it." His voice trembled. "The Mungans used to tell stories about a hunger that lives in forgotten places. They said the more you recall it, the stronger it gets. The act of remembering keeps it alive." "That's folklore," I snapped. "Metaphor, symbolism." He exhaled sharply. "You still don't get it, do you? You academics never do. Some stories were never meant to be studied. They were meant to be buried." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I tried calling him back. No answer. The next morning I got an email from his department chair. Daniel had been found dead in his office. No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle. But according to the coroner, he looked decades older than his actual age. His colleagues swore he was only 43. His death certificate listed him at 78. That was the moment I stopped denying the impossible. I became obsessed, not in the academic sense anymore, but personally, desperately. I needed to understand what Hollow Creek had done to me. I pored through the photos I'd taken of Oneida's home, zooming in on the carved words, "It feeds." The letters weren't uniform. They looked written by several hands, almost as if each generation had traced over the message, keeping it alive. In another photo, something caught my eye, on the wall just beside the bed. What I dismissed as wood grain now looked like a faint series of handprints, overlapping, layered, smaller and smaller, toward the top, like the growth rings of a tree. It wasn't art, it was evidence. I had to go back. The university refused to authorize another field visit, claiming it was unsafe. That didn't stop me. 3 days later, I packed my car with supplies, camera, recorder, a small revolver I'd borrowed from a friend's glove compartment, and drove north again. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, dusk was settling in. The same fog from my first visit clung to the trees, curling low to the ground like smoke. The air was heavy with silence. I parked near the remains of the general store, now reduced to a sagging frame of wood. The sign that once read Hollow Creek Market had fallen, half buried in moss. "Just one night," I whispered to myself. "Document and leave." The path up the ridge was harder to follow this time. The forest seemed denser, the trees closer together. My flashlight beam bounced off the fog, illuminating nothing beyond a few feet. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. I spun around, but there was only the dark. When I reached the clearing, my chest tightened. The houses were still there, but different somehow. Smaller, warped, as if the land itself had been folding inward. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a well. I was sure it hadn't been there before. Its stones were slick with moss, the mouth covered by a decaying wooden lid. From inside came a faint sound, steady, rhythmic, not quite breathing, not quite wind. I crouched beside it and lifted the lid. The smell hit me instantly, damp earth, rot, and something metallic like rusted blood. My flashlight barely reached the bottom. I saw no movement, no shape, just darkness that seemed to absorb the light. And then from below, a whisper. "Mira." I dropped the light. It hit the stones with a hollow clang and went out. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing, heart hammering. My name echoed from the well again, stretched and distorted. "Mira. Stay." It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, old, young, male, female, all layered together, all pleading. "Stay. Feed." I turned and ran, branches clawing at my jacket. I didn't stop until I reached the car. When I looked back, I saw movement at the top of the ridge. Figures, dozens of them, standing in silence. Their silhouettes flickered in and out of the fog like the remnants of a dying fire. They didn't follow. They didn't have to. I already knew. Once you hear your name whispered by the mountain, part of you stays behind. Back home, things unraveled quickly. I recorded my symptoms in my research journal, more out of habit than hope. Rapid aging, weight loss, hair turning white, night sweats, insomnia. But there was another change, something harder to define. At night, when I passed mirrors, my reflection would lag a fraction of a second behind. Sometimes it smiled when I didn't. Sometimes its eyes followed me after I'd turned away. And when I dreamed now, I wasn't in the bed anymore. I was standing over it, watching myself sleep. I don't know why, I kept documenting everything. Maybe because that's what I was trained to do, to record, to observe, to make sense of chaos. But the more I wrote, the worse the symptoms became. The phrase Daniel had warned me about echoed in my head. It feeds through the remembering. By writing about it, I was feeding it. By telling the story, I was aging faster. I tried to stop. I really did. But the hunger that comes with obsession is stronger than fear. It's the same hunger that drives scientists to study volcanoes, divers to chase wrecks, and fools to chase ghosts. I needed to know what it was. So I made one final entry in my notes, a hypothesis, if you can call it that. The phenomenon of Hollow Creek represents a metaphysical organism that sustains itself through memory. It consumes time not as energy, but as devotion. Every retelling is a ritual act extending its existence. Those who witness it become vessels, leaking years with every recollection. After writing that, I burned the notebook. It didn't help. 3 nights ago, I woke to find the graying of my hair complete. My skin felt paper thin. The veins on my hands stood out like black rivers. I knew then that I didn't have much time left. I recorded this final statement not for publication, but as a warning for anyone who ever finds themselves in those mountains, chasing the same curiosity I did. There are stories that study you back. If you ever find yourself near the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, and you come across a trail that isn't on any map, turn around. If you hear whispers from an empty house or a voice that calls your name from the dark, don't answer. And if an old woman ever looks at you with eyes that have outlived generations, run. Because once you hear the words, "It eats the years," it's already too late. I don't know how long I've been writing this. Time doesn't behave normally anymore. The clock on the wall hasn't moved in hours, but the shadows keep changing. My reflection is barely recognizable now, an old woman staring back from the glass. Sometimes I think I see Oneta behind me, standing in the corner of my apartment, smiling. Sometimes I hear the whispering, closer than ever. They want me to finish the story, to feed it one last time. So here it is. My name is Dr. Mira Sanders. I was 33 years old when I went to Hollow Creek. Now I am 112, and it still isn't done eating. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Stories like this one survive because people like you keep them alive. But be careful what you keep alive. If you want to hear more true Appalachian stories, tales that walk the thin line between legend and nightmare, subscribe to the channel and make sure notifications are on. Because the next story I'm going to tell comes from even deeper in the mountains. And trust me, some things up there don't just take your time, they take your soul. People think the Bell Witch is just another campfire story, a southern ghost tale to scare tourists on late-night cave tours. But the truth is that her story sits inside real legal records, death certificates, and journal entries so detailed that historians still argue whether the Bells of Robertson County, Tennessee, were haunted by a spirit or destroyed by something far worse. My name is Hannah Pierce, and for the past year I've been investigating the Bell Witch legend as part of a documentary series on America's unsolved hauntings. Most stories start with exaggerations and end with folklore. This one starts with documented fact. December 20th, 1820, John Bell Sr., patriarch of a prosperous Tennessee farm, dies mysteriously. His death is listed in local records as the work of spirits. It remains to this day the only American death officially attributed to a supernatural entity. The locals called her Kate, the Bell Witch. But before Kate became legend, she was a whisper in the walls of a family home. The Bell family had settled along the Red River 15 years earlier, carving a 360-acre farm from the Tennessee wilderness. By 1817, John Bell's crops of corn and cotton grew tall enough to make him one of the county's wealthiest men. He and his wife, Lucy, raised 9 children in a white-clapboard farmhouse framed by oak and hickory trees. On warm nights, Lucy played hymns on the small square piano in the parlor, while her youngest, Betsy, recited verses beside her. The house, neighbors said, stood as peaceful as the Lord's own garden. Then, one humid August evening, John Bell heard something tapping against the outer wall. At first, he thought it was a loose shutter. He went outside with a lantern. The air was heavy with crickets and river mist. Nothing stirred. The next night, the knocking came again, louder, deliberate, 3 short raps near the back door. When he stepped outside this time, the tapping moved, as if following him around the house. "Wind," he muttered, "just the wind." But Lucy heard it too, and so did the children. Within days, the sounds grew bolder, scratching along the walls, heavy thuds on the floorboards, the distinct creak of footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway long after everyone had gone to bed. At first, John kept it to himself, fearing ridicule from neighbors. But when the scratching turned into violent pounding that shook the rafters, he admitted defeat and called a meeting. The family gathered in the parlor, oil lamp flickering. John's eldest son, John Jr., fetched his musket and fired a single shot through the ceiling where the noise was loudest. Silence fell. Then from behind the wall came a slow, mocking knock, knock, knock. A week later, John walked his property at dusk, hoping to find the source, maybe an animal nesting near the foundation. The fields glowed bronze in the fading light. Near the far edge of the cornfield, something moved between the rows. A dark shape hunched low. John squinted and raised his musket. "Who's there?" The figure stepped into view. It looked like a dog. No, larger. Its body was canine, but its head, wrong. Too round, with ears that stuck straight up like a rabbit's. Its eyes glinted red in the lantern light. John fired. The creature vanished, not ran, vanished, leaving only silence and the echo of his own heartbeat. That night the pounding returned stronger than ever. The children woke screaming. Betsy swore she'd felt something pull at her hair. Sheets ripped themselves from beds. Pots clanged in the kitchen, though no one was there. By morning, every chair in the house had been turned upside down. Lucy, pale and trembling, whispered a verse from Psalms. John Jr. nailed iron crosses over the doors, and still the sounds came. Laughing now, faint but cruel. It began to speak in late autumn. At first, it was just murmurs beneath the floorboards. A woman's whisper reciting verses from the Bible, sometimes backward, sometimes in a language none recognized. Then, one evening, as the bells prayed together, the whisper cut through the Lord's Prayer. "Amen," it said, perfectly clear, perfectly human. Every head snapped up. "Who's there?" John demanded. Silence. Then laughter, harsh, rasping, close enough to feel its breath. From that night forward, the unseen voice grew bold. It mocked them, sang hymns in Lucy's tone, called the children by name. It would wake Betsy by murmuring inches from her ear, "Pretty Betsy Belle." The family sought help from neighbors who, upon visiting, left in terror. A preacher claimed the house was under demonic siege. A skeptic spent the night to debunk the haunting and fled before dawn, pale as linen, insisting he'd heard his dead mother calling from the walls. Word spread across Robertson County. Crowds began to gather on Sundays, hoping to hear the witch speak, and she did, to everyone, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, but always aware. "I am what was, what is, and what will never die," she said once when asked who she was. Locals began calling her Kate, linking the voice to a woman named Kate Batts, a neighbor who had once accused John Bell of cheating her in a land deal. Kate had died years earlier, but gossip insists grudges don't need flesh to endure. "Kate's come back for her revenge," folks whispered. Of all the Bells, 12-year-old Betsy suffered most. At night, invisible hands pinched and slapped her. Her braids were yanked until her scalp bled. The voice taunted her endlessly. "Betsy loves Joshua Gardner," it would croon, the local boy she'd been courting, then erupt into mocking laughter that shook the rafters. Neighbors witnessed it, ministers too. They saw the welts rise on her skin as though struck by invisible ropes. No one could explain it. One evening, as Lucy prayed over her daughter, the witch whispered tenderly, "I love you, Lucy Bell." Then her tone changed. "But he is mine." The candlelight flickered violently. Betsy's body stiffened, eyes rolling back. From her mouth came a voice not her own, deep, mocking, triumphant. Lucy clutched her daughter, sobbing, "Leave her be." The room fell silent except for Betsy's shuddering breaths. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. By 1819, the Bell haunting had become national news. Even General Andrew Jackson, soon to be president, heard of it. He wrote that a spirit of extraordinary power had taken possession of a Tennessee family. Jackson decided to see for himself. The general and his men arrived on horseback one autumn evening, wagons loaded with supplies. As they neared the Bell farm, the wheels of the lead wagon froze mid-turn, as if locked by invisible chains. The horses reared and refused to move. "By the Eternal," Jackson exclaimed, "it must be the witch." A disembodied voice answered from the trees. "General, I'm pleased you could make it." The horses bolted backward, nearly overturning the wagon. Jackson's men begged to leave at once. He ordered them to hold their ground. That night they camped near the Bell home. The witch visited, laughing and shouting insults, calling each soldier by name, though she'd never met them. One man screamed that something was clawing his back. When others looked, deep scratches appeared beneath his shirt. By dawn, Jackson and his troops fled. He later wrote, "I'd rather face the entire British Army than spend another night with the Bell Witch." After Jackson's visit, the witch's wrath sharpened its focus. John Bell Sr. began to waste away. At first, it was dizziness, small lapses of memory. The way he'd forget a prayer halfway through saying it. Then came the tremors. His tongue swelled until words were slurred. His eyes lost their color. Lucy prepared tonics. Neighbors prayed. Ministers sprinkled holy water. None of it mattered. The witch mocked every attempt. "I'll have him before the snow falls," the voice whispered one night from the rafters. "The man who wronged me will never draw another easy breath." Lucy begged it to stop. "Name your price," she pleaded. The reply was soft, almost tender. "Already paid." From that night forward, John rarely left his bed. Every evening the house filled with the stench of sulfur. Rats were found drowned in the well. Dogs refused to cross the threshold. When the children tried to recite scripture, the witch joined in, perfectly, flawlessly, until they faltered in terror. Then she laughed. Neighbors claimed the Bell farm looked different now, the trees leaning inward, the air around it humming like a beehive. Men stopped working the fields after dark. By December 1820, frost covered the fields. John Bell lay motionless, his breath a rattle. Lucy kept vigil beside him, her Bible trembling in her hands. That morning she reached for the medicine vial the doctor had left on the table. Brown glass, clear liquid. She found it empty. In its place sat a different vial, smaller, cloudy, half filled with something black and tar-thick. "What's this?" she whispered. From nowhere, the witch's voice rang through the room. "It's what killed him." The family froze. Betsy screamed. When John Jr. touched the vial, it burned his fingers. They threw it into the fire. The flames turned blue and hissed like a living thing. Moments later, John Bell gasped once, shuddered, and went still. Outside, the wind rose into a shriek that shook the shutters, and over it came laughter, wild, triumphant, echoing across the frozen fields. The next morning, the witch's voice returned for one last taunt. "I fixed him," she said. "He'll never cheat another soul." At the funeral, every hymn faltered in the air. The neighbors swore they heard a woman laughing through the hymnal verses, though no woman stood nearby. The death was entered into county records with a single chilling note: John Bell, deceased. Cause attributed to the acts of an invisible power. It remains the only such entry in American legal history. For months after John's burial, the witch lingered. She teased the grieving Bells, whispered in Lucy's ear at night, rattled the walls. Then one spring morning she announced, almost casually, "I will leave you now, but I shall return in 7 years." And as suddenly as it began, the haunting stopped. Life crept back into Red River. Crops grew again, children laughed, and the Bells tried to forget. But in 1828, exactly 7 years later, the witch returned. This time her voice came softer, sadder, as if age had dulled her rage. She spoke mostly to John Bell, Jr., warning him of wars and calamities to come. She predicted the Civil War nearly 30 years before it began, even naming generals not yet born. Then she said farewell, promising to visit again in 107 years. That would be 1935. No one ever reported hearing her again, at least not publicly. When I, Hannah Pierce, arrived in Adams, Tennessee, almost 2 centuries later, the Bell family farmhouse was long gone. All that remained was a limestone cave near the Red River, the site locals now call the Bell Witch Cave. Tour guides turned it into a curiosity, a place for ghost hunters and late-night thrill seekers. But among the locals, there's still a rule, whispered quietly: don't mock her inside the cave. I joined one of those tours last fall. My team carried thermal cameras, audio recorders, the usual gear. The guide, an older woman with a soft Tennessee accent, warned us as we stepped through the entrance. "She doesn't like flashlights pointed at the ceiling," she said. "That's where she watches." The air grew colder the deeper we went. The limestone walls glistened with moisture. Water dripped steadily from above, echoing like faint tapping. We paused near a natural alcove the locals call the Witch's Chair. Our guide told us it was where Kate liked to sit and listen to visitors. One of my cameramen, a skeptic named Trevor, chuckled. "If she's real, she's had 200 years to move on." The guide's face drained of color. "You shouldn't say that." Before anyone could respond, a loud crack echoed through the cave, sharp and violent like a whip against stone. Our flashlights flickered. Trevor's camera shut off. "Did you hear that?" he muttered. Another crack, then a whisper so close to the microphone it made the speakers hum. "I'm still here." Every light went out. I felt a rush of wind sweep past, though the air underground should have been still. For 3 seconds, no more, the darkness pulsed with something alive, heavy, ancient. When the lights returned, Trevor was staring at the chair, frozen. On the back of his neck were 3 deep welts already swelling. He quit the production the next day. Back home, I reviewed the audio. For the most part, it was static, until that same whisper repeated at irregular intervals. Sometimes in a woman's voice, sometimes in a child's. Always the same words: "I'm still here." We submitted the recordings to an acoustics lab at Vanderbilt University. The technician ran spectral analysis and frowned. "These frequencies shouldn't exist," he said. "They're too low for a human voice, but they form language patterns, almost like layers." "Layers of what?" I asked. "Voices." He showed me the graph. There weren't 1 or 2, but hundreds of overlapping tonal signatures, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. That night I dreamed of the Bell farmhouse. The fields were gone, replaced by water. Beneath the surface, faces drifted like reflections. Lucy, John, Betsy, all watching. When I woke, my recorder, turned off the night before, was running. On it was a single sentence whispered through static: "Tell them the debt's not paid." Modern historians still argue over the Bell Witch. Some say mass hysteria, others a fraud, others a cautionary tale about guilt and religion on the frontier. But standing inside that cave, hearing my name whispered in the dark, I realized the Bell Witch isn't just history, she's pattern. Every generation tells her story. Every retelling feeds her name, the same way an echo strengthens between canyon walls. Maybe that's why the legend never fades, because we keep saying it. And maybe, somewhere along the Red River, a spirit waits for the next storyteller to speak aloud, so she can answer back. The tape we recorded that night ends with one last sound, a single knock, then 3 more, the same rhythm that once echoed through the Bell farmhouse 200 years ago. Knock, 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 pause, knock. I've played that section more times than I should. Every time, just before the final knock, there's a faint breath, a whisper I can't quite prove is real. Welcome back to Red River. If you made it to the end of this investigation, thank you. These mountains keep their secrets, but telling them keeps history alive. Sometimes too alive. If you'd like to hear the next Appalachian mystery we're uncovering, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support lets us keep exploring America's oldest legends, even the ones that still whisper back. They say the mountains remember every scream. That's what an old park ranger told me when I first went digging into the legend of the Hollow Man. My name is Eli Turner, and I investigate the forgotten horrors buried in America's oldest landscapes. Some stories are easy to dismiss, campfire yarns, exaggerated ghost tales, but others hide too much truth to ignore. The Hollow Man is one of those. Lost Creek sits deep in the Cumberland Mountains of Kentucky, where fog moves like a living thing and hollers twist into each other like veins. It's a place with no cell signal, no streetlights, and barely any memory of the modern world. Locals there still whisper about a figure that walks the woods near the old mining shafts. Tall, thin, and hollow-eyed. They call him the Hollow Man because of the sound he makes when he breathes. A wheezing, empty whistle, like air passing through an old bottle. When I started looking into the story, I thought it was just another cryptid tale. But what I found in the county archives told a much darker story, one that began not with a monster, but with a man named Henry Collier. Henry was a miner in 1952, back when Lost Creek still lived and died by coal. He was 34, quiet, devoted to his wife Ruth and their little boy Caleb. On February 11th, Henry volunteered for an overnight shift at mine number 7 after a cave-in left 2 men trapped. The company called it routine rescue work. In truth, it was desperate. The tunnels were unstable. The air carried the bitter tang of methane, but Henry went anyway. Those men got families, he told Ruth before leaving. If I don't help, who will? He kissed her forehead, took his lamp, and disappeared into the dark. He never came back. Rescuers said the tunnel collapsed again just before dawn. They spent 2 weeks digging through rock and debris, but never found his body, or the others. The mine was sealed, the company folded, and the mountains swallowed its dead. Ruth stayed in Lost Creek, raising Caleb alone. People said she changed after that, quiet, distracted, always staring toward the ridgeline where the mine entrance used to be. Then, one night in 1954, she heard tapping on her window. Tap, tap, tap. She thought it was a tree branch, but when she opened the curtain, she saw a shadow standing in the yard. It was tall, thin, still. The porch light caught something glinting in its hand, a miner's lamp. She screamed. By the time the neighbors came running, the yard was empty. The only trace left behind was a set of footprints in the mud, bare feet, each print filled with black water. Nearly 70 years later, I found Ruth Collier's name in an old sheriff's ledger. While researching cold cases, written in shaky pen beside her name were 3 words: "Still hears tapping." That note led me to her grandson, David Collier, who still lived in Lost Creek. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, with the cautious politeness of someone who'd spent too long keeping family secrets. "I know what you're here for," he said when I introduced myself. The Hollow Man. My grandma warned us never to talk about him. We sat on his porch, overlooking the woods. The evening mist rolled in slow, the kind that turned the trees into silhouettes. David handed me a shoebox filled with cassette tapes. She started recording herself in the 60s, he said. Said the noises came back. You can hear it. That night, in my motel room, I played the first tape. The hiss of old tape filled the room, followed by Ruth's trembling voice. February 11th again. I hear it every year, the tapping, like knuckles on glass. Henry, if it's you, please stop. Then came it, faint at first, then unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't coming from the recording. It was coming from the walls of the motel room. I froze the playback. The sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. 3 short, 1 long. The same pattern I'd heard in a dozen Appalachian stories before, including the mines of Black Hollow Ridge. I left the room that night and slept in my truck. 2 days later, I convinced David to take me to the old mining site. We drove up a road so overgrown it looked like the forest was trying to erase it. The entrance to mine number 7 was still sealed, marked by a rusted sign that read, "Danger, collapse risk." A thin stream of air hissed through cracks in the rock, carrying with it the smell of iron and decay. "This is where my granddad died," David said quietly, "but sometimes when it's cold enough, you can still see the light." "What light?" He pointed toward the tunnel. His lamp. "People say they've seen it flicker in there, moving deeper." I stepped closer to the rock face. For a moment I thought I heard something behind the wind, a hollow rhythmic sound, breath drawn through an empty pipe. Then, as if on cue, 3 knocks echoed faintly from inside the mountain. Tap, tap, tap. I turned to David, expecting him to look terrified. Instead, he just nodded. "See? Told you?" We didn't stay long. The air grew colder the longer we stood there, and I could feel the faintest vibration under my boots, like something deep below shifting in its sleep. As we walked back to the truck, David said something that stayed with me. "You know what Grandma used to say? She said the mine didn't collapse on them men. It swallowed them. Said they dug too deep and found something that was already digging its way out." I couldn't stop thinking about those words, already digging its way out. Back in my apartment, I began to notice things. The sound of tapping, faint at first, then nightly. The whistling draft that seemed to follow me from room to room. One morning, my bathroom mirror fogged over even though I hadn't run the shower. When I wiped it clear, there were words traced in the condensation. "Still here." That night, I played another of Ruth's tapes. Her voice was weaker, raspier, like an old woman out of breath. "It's inside the walls now. It sounds like breathing through a flute. Henry, if you can hear me, I forgive you. Please, rest." Then a long silence. Then a new voice, faint but distinct, male, hollow, distant. "Ruth." The tape cut out. I shut it off and sat in the dark for a long time. The air in my apartment felt heavy, thick with something unseen. And beneath the hum of the refrigerator, I could hear it again, that slow, hollow breathing, not coming from outside, coming from behind the walls. After that last tape, sleep became impossible. Every sound in the apartment turned into a pattern, pipes clicking, floorboards settling, the wind in the vents. Each rhythm ended the same way. Tap, 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 pause, tap. I told myself that returning to Lost Creek one final time would end it, that if I faced whatever waited in that mine, the noise would stop. So a week later, I packed my recorder, a headlamp, and a borrowed handheld gas monitor. I left before dawn, fog curling off the road like smoke from a dying fire. The hills looked different in winter. Trees stood bare, their limbs skeletal. The old mining road was half-frozen mud, the air brittle with cold. When I reached the barricade at mine number 7, I expected silence. Instead, the mountain was breathing. A low, steady exhale drifted through the cracks in the rock, warm against the icy air. My monitor ticked softly, warning of methane. I ignored it. I wedged my flashlight through an opening and crawled inside. The tunnel yawned wider than I'd imagined. Rusted rail tracks vanished into darkness. The smell of damp iron hung heavy. Every drip of water echoed like footsteps. After a few yards, the ceiling lowered, forcing me to crouch. The beam of my headlamp caught names scratched into the walls. Collier, M. James, Walt S., the trapped miners. Then a fourth name, carved deeper than the rest, Hollow. The gas monitor beeped twice and went silent. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping from deeper inside. Tap, 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 pause, tap. Henry? The word slipped out before I could stop it. The tapping answered, closer now. I kept moving, heart hammering. My light flickered across something metallic, half buried in silt. A rust-eaten lantern, still faintly warm. Inside its cracked glass glowed the dim orange of a dying flame. Impossible. I lifted it, and the air shifted, heavy with the scent of earth after rain. Then came a whisper, thin as breath through bone. Not gone. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern. My light swept across a wall glistening with moisture. And something else. Dozens of shapes protruded from the rock. At first I thought they were old supports or collapsed beams, but as I stepped closer, I saw faces. They weren't carved. They were pressed into the stone, mouths open in silent screams. Eyes hollow. The rock seemed to flex, breathing slowly. I stumbled back, the lantern trembling in my hand. A sound rose from behind me, air rushing through a narrow passage, shaping itself into a whistle that almost formed words. Eli. Every instinct screamed to run, but curiosity anchored me. I turned my recorder on and forced myself to speak. This is Eli Turner, Lost Creek Mine number 7, internal chamber, approximately 40 meters from the entrance. I'm seeing... The breath cut me off. Out of the dark, a figure unfolded. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs the color of wet clay. Where eyes should have been were 2 deep hollows. Each time it inhaled, its chest caved inward with a sound like wind through an empty bottle. The hollow man, he or it, took a step toward me. The air pressure dropped. My ears rang. I backed away, tripping over a rail tie. Henry Collier? I whispered. The thing paused. Its head tilted, slow, deliberate. Then it opened its mouth, and from that void came a voice. Not one, but many, layered and distant. He dug too deep. We all did. The walls trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. My lamp flickered, and in that strobe of failing light, I saw that the faces in the rock weren't still. They were moving, shifting, mouthing words I couldn't hear. When the light died completely, the darkness breathed against my ear. Now you dig. Instinct took over. I threw the lantern toward the sound and ran. The tunnel seemed to stretch, every turn repeating itself. The air grew hotter with each step. Behind me, the hollow breathing grew faster, chasing. When my headlamp finally flared back to life, I saw daylight ahead. I lunged for it, scraping my palms raw against stone. The instant I burst outside, the noise stopped. No breathing, no tapping, only the wind through bare trees. I fell to my knees in the snow, gasping. The opening behind me looked smaller than before. as if the mountain had closed its mouth. I didn't go back for my recorder. I couldn't. Back home, the silence felt worse than the noise. I convinced myself I'd hallucinated from gas exposure. But 3 days later, a package arrived at my mailbox. No return address. Inside was my recorder. It was crusted with red clay, still damp. When I played it, the first minute was static. Then came my voice, trembling as I described the cavern. After that, nothing but breathing. Long, hollow inhalations and exhalations, followed by a new sound, digging. At the end, another voice joined mine. "You left the door open." I dropped the recorder, heart racing. From the far corner of my apartment came a faint answering sound. Tap, 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 pause, tap. The floorboards creaked, expanding outward as if something beneath them was moving. I grabbed my keys and fled into the night. Since that night, I've noticed reports spreading across neighboring counties. Hikers hearing tapping in cave walls, campers waking to find thin handprints pressed into tent fabric, miners in new sites swearing they hear breathing behind sealed rock. Every place sits on a vein connected to Lost Creek. Whatever the Hollow Man is, he's no longer confined to one mountain. Maybe he was never a man at all. Maybe he's what's left when the earth swallows our dead and exhales what it can't digest. A voice, an emptiness shaped like us. When I asked an old geologist about resonant caverns in that region, he said something that chilled me. "Some mines whistle by themselves," he told me. "Air currents slip through the cracks, and if the chambers are shaped just right, they make sound. But sometimes those sounds repeat patterns that shouldn't exist. It's like the mountain remembers what the men used to say. Remembers, or mimics. I kept one final tape, the one I made after the mine. I play it only when I need to remind myself that what I saw was real. At the 38-second mark, between my words and the static, there's a faint rhythmic pulse. I ran it through spectral analysis. It matches the exact tempo of a human heartbeat, but it isn't mine. I had the lab confirm that the pulse belongs to someone who'd been dead for decades. Blood type and rhythm matching an archived medical report for Henry Collier. The conclusion terrified even the technician. The mine wasn't echoing me. It was recording me the way lungs record breath. Every sound inside that mountain becomes part of it. Every name spoken feeds the shape that still walks there. That's what hollow means. Not empty, absorbed. If you ever find yourself driving through eastern Kentucky and see a rusted sign marked Lost Creek Mining Co., don't stop. If you hear knocking from the trees, don't answer. And if you wake to a breath against your ear that sounds like the wind through a bottle, run, because the Hollow Man isn't looking for company. He's looking to fill the silence you leave behind. There are sounds the Blue Ridge keeps for itself. Not the wind, not the rain, but the kind that hums inside the mountains. Low, pulsing like a heartbeat too deep to belong to any living thing. My name is Dr. Mara Keene, and I study them. Not ghosts, not folklore, but resonance. The strange ways stone can carry sound. How air trapped underground vibrates at human frequencies. But every so often the data stops being data and turns into something you can't quite explain. This case began with a series of field recordings taken near Linville Gorge, North Carolina. A hiker captured a sound rising from beneath the ridge, repeating at near-perfect intervals, too rhythmic for wind, too deep for machinery. He posted it online. Locals called it the Cry of the Ridge. Within a week, 3 more hikers disappeared along the same trail. That's when I was sent in, part scientist, part skeptic, part fool, trying to listen for truth in the dark. The first night I camped along the ridge, I set up 3 seismic mics and a wide-range recorder tuned for infrasound. The forest was quiet, except for cicadas. The sky above the gorge burned orange before collapsing into night. At 11:47 p.m., the forest went still. My sensors picked up the first pulse. It came every 17 seconds, a low, droning thump that shook the ground just enough to rattle my metal mug. I remember whispering into my recorder, "Sounds like a heartbeat." Then I heard it with my own ears. Faint, human. Someone was humming in the distance. I stepped outside my tent and called out, "Hello." The humming stopped. From far down the slope came a single echo, not of my voice, but of something older. A woman's whisper, soft, deliberate, "You found us." The air pressure dropped, my ears popped, and then, as suddenly as it began, everything went silent again. The next morning, I drove into the small town of Linville Falls to review the data. The diner was nearly empty except for a few locals and a gray-haired park ranger named Harlan Watts. He noticed my field gear and smiled wearily. "You hear about the sound?" I nodded. "Folks been hearing it since my daddy's day," he said. "Used to call it the choir. Thought it was ghosts of the old miners or the Cherokee dead, depending who you asked." "You ever hear it yourself?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Once, back in '78. Thought it was wind in the gorge till it started singing my name." I told him about my recordings, about the pulse and the hum. He just nodded like he'd expected it. Then he scribbled an address on a napkin. "You'll want to see the church," he said. They kept records. The road to Craggy Hollow wound through a valley lined with skeletal trees. At the end stood a white clapboard church, half collapsed, its steeple leaning like a tired sentinel. Inside, sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating pews coated in dust. A Bible lay open on the altar, its pages fused together by damp. In the back room, I found a filing cabinet full of yellowed papers, sermons, letters, birth records. One document, handwritten in spidery script, caught my eye. June 5th, 1902. Brother Silas claims the mountain sings when we pray. He says the earth remembers our voices. The choir beneath the ridge grows louder each week. Another entry, months later. The singing has turned mournful. Children fall ill. The ground hums, even when no one prays. We have sealed the well. A map tucked behind the page showed a red X about a mile north of the church, right where my sensors had picked up the strongest readings. The well. At dusk, I hiked toward the X. The trail narrowed into a corridor of moss and rock. The trees grew twisted as if bent by centuries of wind that never touched anything else. When I reached the clearing, I saw it. A circle of stones half buried in vines. At the center, a wooden cover sealed with rusted nails. The old church well. The air around it vibrated softly like a cello string plucked beneath the earth. I set my recorder on the stones and pressed record. The infrasound registered immediately, a low hum rising from the ground. Then, faintly, another sound layered over it. Voices, dozens of them whispering in harmony, words too blurred to understand. I leaned closer. "Is someone there?" The whisper stopped. Then just once, a single voice answered, hoarse, echoing, right beside my ear. "Still here." My recorder spiked. The ground beneath the well trembled. Something inside was moving. I stepped back, heart pounding, as the wood above the well flexed outward with a deep, wet crack. The sound that came next was not a voice, but a cry, long, low, and utterly human. I ran until the forest opened up to the road where my car waited under the fading moonlight. I didn't sleep that night. Back at my hotel, I reviewed the recording. For the first hour, it was mostly static, but then the hum returned, layered with faint choral tones rising and falling in perfect rhythm. At the 47-minute mark, the voices became clear enough to make out a few words. We were buried alive. I paused the audio, breath caught in my throat. The pitch of the hum matched the frequency of collapsing rock, measured during historic mine disasters. These weren't random sounds. They were a record, a geological echo of death. But there was something else beneath the voices. A deeper pulse that came once every 17 seconds, like before. A heartbeat. I checked the timestamp. It matched exactly the moment I'd first heard the humming in the gorge. I realized then that whatever had been buried under that mountain wasn't entirely gone. The ridge was breathing and I'd awakened it. The next morning, Ranger Harlan met me at the diner again. His face went pale when I told him about the well. That place was closed off for a reason, he said. In 1903, a landslide buried half that congregation alive. They were holding a midnight service, singing in the cellar. Ground opened up and took them. I told him about the humming, the heartbeat. He sighed. Some folks say the mountain kept their song. He leaned forward, voice dropping. You didn't open that well, did you? I hesitated. It moved on its own. His eyes went wide. Then you better leave before dark. Once the ridge starts to sing again, it don't stop. I should have listened. But curiosity, no obsession, pulled me back. That night I returned to the site, driven by a need I couldn't name. The air grew heavier the closer I got, like walking into the pressure before a storm. From the tree line I saw the clearing again, and froze. The wooden cover of the well was gone. The stones around it glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with that same slow heartbeat. The hum had become a melody now, weaving through the forest like a hymn sung underwater. I turned on my recorder and whispered, Marrakeen, Blue Ridge Field site. The well is... A voice cut through the air, not from below, but from behind me. You shouldn't have come back. I spun around. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing. Her clothes were old-fashioned, her skin pale, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the stones. Who are you? I managed. She tilted her head. You heard us. You listened. Now we can listen too. Her voice carried the same tremor as the hum beneath the ground. The earth quaked. The trees shuddered. And then from the open well, a gust of air rose like a sigh from 1,000 lungs. The hum turned into a song. And every part of the forest, every leaf, every root sang with it. The song rose slowly, trembling through the forest until even the stars seemed to vibrate. It wasn't loud, it was low, resonant, like the earth itself humming under its breath. The woman in the clearing stepped closer. They never stopped singing, she said, even when the ground closed over them. Her voice layered perfectly with the hum below, as if she were only one part of a larger chorus. I took a cautious step back. You're one of them? She smiled faintly. Once. Why are you here? To be remembered, to finish the hymn. The wind carried her words, blending them with the sound of the mountain until her voice seemed to come from everywhere. I looked down at the open well. The stones around it glowed brighter, blue now like veins of light pulsing with life. Inside, darkness rippled like water. I couldn't see a bottom. The woman lifted her hand, palm facing the sky. Every song is a prayer, she said softly, and every prayer leaves an echo. We were never meant to be buried with ours. Before I could respond, the ground trembled again. A low rumble rolled through the valley, and I heard more voices rising from beneath the soil, men, women, children, an entire congregation finding breath again. The trees bowed inward as if the forest itself were listening. "Make it stop," I whispered. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something ancient there. Not anger, not malice, but pleading. "You woke it," she said. "Now you must listen until it ends." I don't know how long I stood there, minutes, maybe hours, recording, listening, half convinced I'd lost my mind. The song built and built, harmonies blooming like waves of light under the ground. Then slowly it began to change. The melody twisted, slipping from sorrow into warning. The hum grew deeper, heavier, until I could feel it in my chest. My recorder crackled with feedback, and beneath the noise another voice spoke, quiet, masculine, steady. We were not alone down there. I froze. The woman's head turned sharply, eyes wide. The ground split open with a sound like thunder. The glow vanished, replaced by cold air rushing upward, smelling of iron and stone. In that wind came whispers, hundreds of them overlapping, desperate, afraid. "Let us rest. Don't dig. Seal the well." The woman looked at me. "You have to close it," she said, "before the earth remembers too much." "How?" "Bury the sound." I didn't understand until I realized the recorder was still running. Every vibration, every voice was being captured, amplified. If the mountain held echoes, then maybe recording them was how they spread. I shut the device off. Instantly the wind fell silent. The trees stopped trembling. Only the faint hum remained, softer now, fading into the soil. The woman nodded once. "It's enough." And then she was gone. No flash, no scream. Just gone. The clearing was empty except for the faint afterglow of the stones and the open well, which now looked like nothing more than a shadow in the dirt. I returned to Linville Falls just before dawn, hands still shaking. Ranger Harlan was waiting at the diner, his coffee untouched. "You went back, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. He sighed. "I felt it last night. Whole ridge was vibrating." "I closed it," I said quietly. "At least, I think I did." He studied me for a long time. "The mountain's old," he said. "It remembers more than we do. Best thing you can do now is forget." But forgetting wasn't an option. When I played back the recording the next day, there was nothing. No hum, no voices, just silence. Except right at the end, a single whisper. "Thank you." After that, the sound reports stopped. Hikers returned to the gorge without incident. For the first time in months, the mountains were quiet. But sometimes when I play the file on a spectrogram, faint lines appear. Tiny vibrations hidden deep in the frequency floor. If you slow them down enough, they almost sound like music. 6 months later, I was invited to present my research at UNC Chapel Hill. My talk was about subterranean acoustics and cultural memory, a dry title for what had almost cost me my sanity. After the lecture, a young graduate student approached me. She handed me a flash drive. "My uncle's a ranger up near Mount Mitchell," she said. "He found this recording last week, said it reminded him of your work." That night in my hotel, I plugged it in. At first, static, then a familiar hum. Slow, steady, every 17 seconds. But this time, it wasn't coming from under the mountain. It was coming from above. The spectrogram showed something new. The frequency had inverted, mirroring itself, as if the ridge wasn't echoing the voices anymore. Something in the air was. I looked out the window toward the distant line of the Blue Ridge. Lightning flickered behind the peaks, flashing white against the black sky. The hum grew louder through my speakers until it drowned everything else, and then, through the distortion, a voice rose clear and close. "We remember you." The power went out. When it came back, the file was gone. It's easy to think of legends as noise, stories layered over the static of history. But sometimes the static itself is what matters. The Appalachians are the oldest mountains on Earth. Every sound ever made within them still trembles somewhere in their stone. Gunfire, sermons, laughter, collapse, prayer. Maybe that's all ghosts are, memory that refuses to fade. I went back to Linville one last time. Months later, the church had finally collapsed into a heap of wood and ivy. The clearing where the well once stood was covered in grass. I stood there for a while, listening. No hum, no voices, just wind in the trees. And for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen, like the mountain was listening, but kindly now. Before leaving, I placed my old recorder on the stones and pressed record. "Thank you," I said softly, "for reminding us to listen." Then I walked away, leaving it running. Maybe it's still recording even now. Maybe the mountain needs another voice to remember. Months later, a hiker found a recorder near that same spot. The battery was dead, but the storage card held a single audio file. 20 minutes of near silence, then one clear voice. End of recording. But when analyzed in spectrogram view, hidden beneath the silence was something else. Layers of faint frequencies stacked like chords. When those frequencies were converted to audible sound, they formed a low, steady hum, the exact pulse first recorded in Linville Gorge. The mountain had kept my voice, not as memory, as music. If you followed these stories from the beginning, thank you. Appalachia isn't just haunted, it's alive. It's soil heavy with the echoes of everyone who's ever walked these ridges. If you'd like to keep exploring the stories buried in its shadows, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support keeps the echoes alive, one story at a time. They say time moves slower in these hills, but maybe it doesn't move at all. Maybe the Blue Ridge, the Smokies, the Appalachians, they don't age, they listen. Every step we take, every word we speak, every prayer whispered in fear or love, the mountains keep them. They press them into stone the way memory presses itself into the heart. All those stories you've just heard, the vanished hunter, the whispering mind, the hollow man, the singing ridge, they aren't separate ghosts. They're verses of the same old song, a hymn that never ends, just changes key with every generation that dares to listen. When the wind moves through these valleys at night, some call it just weather, but if you stand still long enough, if you truly listen, you'll hear something else beneath it. Faint, patient, human, not a warning, not a curse, just a reminder that the past doesn't die out here. It waits, and maybe in its own quiet way, it hopes we remember. Not the fear, but the love that built these places. Not the silence, but the song that still hums beneath the earth, where every lost voice still finds its echo. Because in the end, the scariest thing about these mountains isn't that they're haunted, it's that they never forget. We're still here,